When I was 10 years old, my father built a tree house at the edge of our backyard. It wasn't a grand structure, just a simple wooden platform with 4 sturdy walls, a roof, and a little window that overlooked the forest. But to me, it was a castle. My friends and I would climb up there every summer afternoon, pretending it was a pirate ship, a space station, or sometimes just a quiet hideout away from the world. For years, the treehouse was my sanctuary. Even as I grew older, I would occasionally sit there, staring into the dense woods that bordered our property. There was something peaceful about that view, until the summer of 1998. That's when the treehouse stopped being a refuge and became a source of nightmares that haunt me to this day. It started with a sound. It was a humid July evening, and I had climbed up to the treehouse to escape the oppressive heat of the house. The air was still, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in a soft, golden glow. As I sat there scribbling ideas for a short story in my notebook, I heard a low, rhythmic tapping. It was faint at first, almost like the sound of a branch brushing against a window pane. I dismissed it, thinking it was just the wind, but the tapping grew louder. It came in intervals, 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. I leaned out of the treehouse window, scanning the woods below. The forest was dense, a sea of shadows and shifting leaves. But there was no wind, and the branches hung still. Probably a woodpecker, I muttered, trying to convince myself. Yet, as the minutes passed, the sound grew closer. By the time the sun had fully set, the tapping was right beneath the treehouse. My heart began to race. I peered out into the darkness, straining my eyes. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the base of the tree. At first, I thought it was a person, but there was something wrong about it. It was tall, unnaturally so, with long, spindly arms that hung down to its knees. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and its body seemed to sway slightly, as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist. I froze, gripping the edge of the window frame. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, staring, or at least I think it was staring. Its face was obscured, lost in the shadows of the forest. And then it raised one of its long arms and pointed directly at me. I scrambled back from the window, my heart pounding like a drum. My mind raced. Was it a prank? One of my friends trying to scare me? But no one knew I was out there that evening. The tapping started again, this time on the trunk of the tree, right below the treehouse. It was louder now, more deliberate. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice caught in my throat. I did the only thing I could think of. I turned off the small lantern I had brought with me, plunging the treehouse into darkness. For a moment, everything was silent. Then came the scratching. It started low, a faint scraping sound on the wooden boards of the treehouse. Slowly, it grew louder, as if whatever was outside was climbing up. At this point, I was paralyzed with fear. I huddled in the corner of the treehouse, clutching my notebook as if it could somehow protect me. The scratching continued, inching closer and closer. And then it stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was only silence. The kind of silence that presses against your ears, amplifying every heartbeat, every shallow breath. Suddenly, the door to the treehouse creaked open. The door creaked open slowly, the hinges groaning as if they hadn't been used in decades. My breath hitched, and I pressed myself tighter into the corner. I could barely see through the darkness, but the faint moonlight streaming through the window outlined the shape of the doorway. At first, nothing came through. The opening remained empty, save for the soft rustling of leaves outside. I clung to the hope that maybe, just maybe, whatever was out there had left. But then, a hand appeared. It was long and gnarled, with fingers that seemed too many and too thin, like twisted branches stripped of bark. The hand gripped the edge of the doorway, and for a moment, it just held there, unmoving, as if testing the strength of the wood. Then slowly, a second hand joined the first, pulling the rest of the figure into view. It was worse than I could have imagined. The creature was hunched, its elongated body forcing it to crawl to fit through the small doorway. Its skin, or what looked like skin, was pale and mottled, stretched too tightly over sharp, angular bones. It had no discernible eyes, just deep, hollow sockets where its gaze should have been. And its mouth. Oh, its mouth was an open, jagged maw that stretched across half its face, filled with crooked teeth that seemed to glint in the dim light. It didn't move like a human. Its motions were jerky, almost insect-like, as it dragged itself into the treehouse. I bit my lip to stifle a scream. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body refused to cooperate. I could only watch as the creature moved closer, its head tilting back and forth as though it were sniffing the air. When it was just feet away from me, it stopped. For a moment, I thought it might not have noticed me. Its eyeless sockets seemed to scan the room, but there was no way to tell where it was looking. I tried to hold my breath, to make myself as small and invisible as possible. Then, it turned its head sharply in my direction. My blood ran cold as it let out a low, guttural sound, a mix between a growl and a clicking noise. Slowly, it began crawling toward me, its long fingers scraping against the wooden floor. I don't remember making the decision to move. All I know is that 1 second I was frozen in place, and the next I was bolting for the treehouse window. I didn't think about the height. I didn't think about the fact that jumping could break my legs, or worse. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. The creature lunged just as I leapt through the window. I felt its claws graze the back of my shirt, tearing the fabric as I plummeted toward the ground. I landed hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Pain shot through my ankle, but adrenaline forced me to my feet. I glanced back at the treehouse, expecting to see the creature following, but it wasn't there. The doorway was empty, the interior dark and silent once more. I didn't wait to find out if it was still there. Limping as fast as I could, I sprinted back toward the house. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows shifting in my peripheral vision. I could swear I heard that clicking noise following me, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached the safety of my home, I slammed the door shut and locked it. My parents were asleep, unaware of the terror I had just escaped. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of my room, clutching a flashlight and listening for any sign of the creature outside. The next morning, I returned to the treehouse with my father. The door was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. Inside, the floorboards were scratched and gouged, as if something with claws had raked across them. My torn notebook was lying in the corner, pages scattered and crumpled. But there was no sign of the creature. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. The treehouse remained standing for years after, but I never went back inside. Eventually, my father took it down, saying it had become too unsafe. Have you ever felt a place watching you? Like it's alive, breathing, waiting for you to make a mistake? I never believed in that sort of thing, until the summer of 1994. That was the year I came face to face with something I can't explain. Something I've tried to forget for years but can't. And now, I think it's time to tell you about it. It all started when I decided to take a much-needed break from the city. A writer's life can be consuming, and my mind was cluttered with deadlines and noise. So, when an old friend of mine, Chris, invited me to spend the summer at his family's cabin in the woods of northern Vermont, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was a simple, rustic retreat surrounded by dense, ancient trees. Chris had inherited it from his grandfather, who'd built it back in the 1940s. The land itself felt timeless, untouched. It was the kind of place where you could lose yourself, literally and figuratively. When I arrived, Chris greeted me with his signature grin and a cold beer. He wasn't alone. His younger sister, Clara, was there too. Clara had a quiet, observant demeanor, the kind of person who saw more than they let on. "Did Chris tell you about the treehouse?" she asked that first evening as we sat on the porch. "The treehouse," I repeated, curious. Chris chuckled. "Oh, come on, Clara. Don't scare him on his first night here." But Clara didn't laugh. Her expression stayed serious. "It's not a joke. You'll see it soon enough. It's hard to miss." And she was right. The next morning, while wandering the property, I stumbled upon it. A massive treehouse perched high in an ancient oak at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't your typical childhood hangout. This thing was a fortress. Its walls were weathered but solid, the wood blackened as though by fire. though there were no scorch marks. A rope ladder dangled loosely from one side, swaying slightly in the breeze. "Who built this?" I asked Chris when I returned. He shrugged. "Grandpa, or maybe someone before him. No one really knows. It's just always been there." "Do you use it?" Chris shook his head. "No, it's not safe anymore. And honestly, I don't think anyone's gone up there in decades." But I couldn't stop thinking about it. There was something about the treehouse that drew me in. Its presence felt wrong, like it didn't belong, yet I couldn't resist the urge to explore it. That night, I dreamed of the treehouse. In the dream, I was climbing the rope ladder, higher and higher, the air growing colder with each step. When I reached the top, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark, empty space. But it wasn't empty. Something was inside, watching me. I woke up drenched in sweat, the sound of creaking would echoing in my ears. I told myself it was just a dream, nothing more. But the next day, I found myself standing at the base of the treehouse again. The rope ladder swayed invitingly. "Don't!" Clara's voice startled me. She was standing a few feet away, her arms crossed. "You don't want to go up there." "Why not?" She hesitated, glancing back toward the cabin, as if making sure Chris wasn't around. "It's not just a treehouse. It's a doorway. Grandpa used to warn us to stay away, but he wouldn't say why. He'd just say it was dangerous. A doorway to what? I don't know," she admitted. "But I've heard things, footsteps, whispers coming from up there. And once, when I was a kid, I thought I saw someone standing in the window." Her words should have scared me off, but instead, they fueled my curiosity. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the treehouse. I told myself it was just an old structure, nothing more. The climb up the rope ladder was harder than I expected. The wood was rough and splintered, the air growing colder with each rung. By the time I reached the top, my hands were shaking. Not from fear, I told myself, but from exertion. The door was heavier than it looked, and it groaned loudly as I pushed it open. The inside was not what I expected. The walls were covered in carvings, symbols, and shapes I didn't recognize. Strange, jagged lines crisscrossed the floor, and the air was thick, almost suffocating, like the treehouse itself was holding its breath. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The carvings seemed to shift in the light, almost like they were alive. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. "Leave!" I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The whisper was so faint it could have been the wind, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I swept my flashlight across the room, searching for the source. The carvings on the walls seemed to ripple, their shapes twisting into unfamiliar patterns. "Leave!" This time, the voice was louder, closer. It didn't sound angry, just urgent, like it was warning me. "Chris!" I called out, hoping this was some elaborate prank. But as the sound of my voice echoed in the confined space, I knew no one else was there. I was alone, or at least I should have been. I took a cautious step further inside, my foot crunching on something brittle. Looking down, I saw a small pile of bones scattered across the floor. Not large enough to belong to a person, but they weren't animal bones either. They were wrong, twisted, as if the bones had been bent and broken deliberately. I felt a sudden rush of cold air, and the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, shining my flashlight on the door, but it didn't budge when I tried to open it. The latch wasn't locked. It was as if the treehouse itself was holding it closed. "Hello?" I called again, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" The whisper came again, this time right in my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam cutting jagged shadows into the walls. The room grew darker, colder, and then in the corner I saw it. At first, it looked like part of the shadows, something hunched and misshapen, crouched in the farthest corner of the treehouse. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, the thing moved. Slowly, deliberately, it unfolded itself, standing to its full height. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle, and its eyes, they weren't human. They glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The thing stared at me, and for a moment, everything went silent. The world outside the treehouse ceased to exist. It was just me and that thing, and then it spoke. "You've seen too much." Its voice wasn't loud, but it reverberated in my chest, a deep, guttural sound that didn't belong in this world. The thing took a step toward me, its movements jerky, like a marionette being controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. I scrambled for the flashlight, my fingers fumbling as the creature drew closer. When I finally grabbed it and shone the beam on the thing, it recoiled, letting out a guttural hiss. For a split second, I thought I saw its true form, something ancient and decayed, like it had been rotting away for centuries. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I lunged for the door, slamming my shoulder into it with all my strength. The wood groaned and cracked, and finally, the door flew open. I tumbled out, grabbing the rope ladder and sliding down as fast as I could. When my feet hit the ground, I ran. I didn't stop until I was back at the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. Chris and Clara were sitting by the fireplace, their faces pale when they saw me. "You went up there, didn't you?" Clara whispered. I nodded, still gasping for breath. Chris shook his head. "I told you it wasn't safe. Whatever Grandpa was hiding, it's not meant for us." I wanted to argue, to ask more questions, but the truth was I didn't want to know. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the thing in the treehouse, its glowing eyes staring back at me. The next morning, I packed my bags and left. Chris and Clara understood. They didn't try to stop me. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that treehouse. I've tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just an overactive imagination, a trick of the light. But deep down, I know the truth. Some doors aren't meant to be opened, and some places like that treehouse should be left alone. I grew up in a quiet suburban neighborhood surrounded by woods. Like most kids, I spent a lot of my childhood outdoors exploring, playing, and building forts. But there was one place that stood out, a treehouse deep in the woods, which my friends and I built when I was 12. It wasn't your average treehouse. We found an old oak tree that had grown at an odd angle. Its branches spread wide like a natural platform. It seemed perfect. We scavenged with scraps from construction sites, nails from my dad's workshop, and spent weeks hammering away. When it was done, the treehouse felt like a fortress, a hideaway from the world where we could share secrets and tell ghost stories. But from the very beginning, there was something off about that treehouse. The first strange thing happened the night we finished building it. My friends, Sam and Lucas, had gone home, and I stayed behind to clean up. It was late. Dusk had given way to night. I should have left too, but I wanted to enjoy the satisfaction of seeing our hard work complete under the pale moonlight. As I stood there, admiring it, I noticed a faint sound. It was like whispering, soft and indistinct, coming from the woods around me. At first, I thought it was the wind rustling the leaves, but the longer I listened, the more certain I became. These were voices. Low, murmuring voices, just beyond the edge of the clearing. I called out, "Sam, Lucas, is that you guys?" No answer. The whispering stopped suddenly, replaced by an oppressive silence. Even the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, frogs, the occasional owl, had vanished. Unease prickled at my skin, and I bolted for home, leaving the treehouse behind in the dark. Over the next few weeks, we used the treehouse regularly during the day, but at night, we all avoided it. The whispers, it turned out, weren't a one-time occurrence. Sam mentioned hearing them when he stayed late one evening. Lucas swore he saw someone or something moving among the trees while we were up in the treehouse one afternoon. We chalked it up to our imaginations, though it always left us uneasy. One afternoon, we decided to spend the night in the treehouse, a sleepover to prove we weren't scared. We brought sleeping bags, flashlights, and snacks, armed with the bravado of young boys. By the time the sun set, the bravado was gone. The first few hours were fun. We played card games, told stories, and even dared each other to climb higher into the tree. But as the night deepened, the atmosphere changed. It started with the noises again, those faint whispers, drifting through the night air. Sam froze mid-sentence, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Do you guys hear that?" We all nodded, our faces pale in the glow of our flashlights. This time, the whispers were closer, louder, almost as if they were circling us. My heart pounded as I scanned the dark forest below. The beam of my flashlight caught movement, a shadow darting between the trees. "What was that?" Lucas whispered, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to sound braver than I felt. And then something hit the treehouse. It was a loud thud, as if someone or something had thrown a rock at it. We jumped, clutching our flashlights. Another thud followed, then another, shaking the wooden planks beneath us. Panic set in. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No answer, but the whispers grew louder, almost deafening now, a cacophony of unintelligible words that seemed to come from every direction. Then the door to the treehouse, the one we'd built to keep animals out, swung open violently. We screamed. Standing in the doorway was a figure. It was tall and thin, its outline distorted like it wasn't entirely solid. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void of darkness. "Run!" I yelled, grabbing Sam and Lucas. We scrambled down the tree as fast as we could, barely caring if we fell. The whispers followed us all the way back to the safety of the neighborhood, fading only when we reached the glow of the streetlights. The next day, we went back to the treehouse, but something had changed. The wood was rotted, the planks brittle, as if they had aged decades overnight. The rope ladder hung limp, frayed, and useless. We never used the treehouse again. Years later, I did some research on the area. I found out that the woods were once the site of a settlement that had mysteriously disappeared in the late 1800s. Locals claimed the settlers had been cursed, their spirits lingering in the forest. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced, but I do know one thing. That treehouse wasn't just a place for childhood adventures. It was something else entirely, something we were never meant to disturb. I've always been a storyteller. Ever since I was a child, I was drawn to the mysteries of the world, the unexplained, the supernatural, and the things that go bump in the night. As a kid, I lived for the creepy tales that made my skin crawl, and like most children, I created my own little hideaway in the woods. It was a treehouse, an old, rickety thing that I built with my brother. It wasn't much, just some wooden planks and a few old ropes, but it was my sanctuary, my place to escape and imagine. One summer evening, when I was about 10, I remember sitting up in that treehouse, looking out at the dense forest that stretched far beyond our property. There was something about the way the wind whispered through the trees that day, a kind of quiet that seemed to suggest something was wrong. But I didn't think much of it at first. I was alone in the treehouse, my brother off doing whatever boys that age do. I was sitting on the floor of the treehouse, reading a book, but my mind kept wandering. I could feel something watching me, just outside my line of sight, where the trees and shadows blurred together. A chill crawled up my spine. I told myself it was just the wind, but then I heard it, a faint tapping like the sound of fingers tapping on wood. At first, I tried to ignore it. The wind, I thought. Maybe a branch had shifted, but the sound grew louder, closer. Tap, tap, tap. I felt my heart begin to race as I slowly turned my head toward the corner of the treehouse. There in the shadow stood a figure. I froze. It wasn't a person. It wasn't human. At least not in the way I understood people to be. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face, if you could call it that, was just a pale, smooth surface. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, featureless mask of skin. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. It just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. After what felt like an eternity, the figure tilted its head slightly, as if it was studying me. Then, without a sound, it vanished into the shadows. I bolted out of the treehouse, running back to the house as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't go back up there for days, maybe even weeks, but that wasn't the only strange thing to happen at that treehouse. Fast forward a few years. I was in high school now, and the treehouse was barely used anymore. But one day, I found myself up there again, sitting on the edge, letting my legs dangle over the side as I looked out into the woods. I was alone, or so I thought. As I was lost in thought, I heard something behind me, a rustling sound. I turned around quickly, expecting to see an animal or maybe a branch falling. But instead, there was a small, child-sized figure standing in the doorway of the treehouse. It was a little girl, or at least it looked like a little girl. She was wearing a white dress, her hair long and tangled. Her eyes were wide, vacant, as if she were staring right through me. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there was a faint, eerie glow around her. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice trembling. The girl didn't respond. Instead, she stepped closer to me, her feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. There was something wrong about her. The way she moved was unnatural, jerky like a doll on strings. Without thinking, I stood up and took a step toward her. But as soon as I moved, she backed away. I felt a sudden wave of panic rise in my chest. I shouldn't have been there. Something was terribly wrong. "Who are you?" I asked again, but my voice barely escaped my throat. The girl didn't answer. She just continued to move backward, inching closer to the edge of the treehouse. And then, in one swift motion, she leaped off the side. My heart stopped. I rushed to the edge, looking down, expecting to see her fall to the ground. But there was nothing. No trace of her. Just the empty space below. I didn't stay in the treehouse that day. I couldn't. I ran back home, locking myself in my room. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something darker was at play. Weeks passed, and I tried to move on from the strange events that had happened in that treehouse. But then one night, I received a call that would forever change the way I saw that place. It was my older brother calling from his college dorm. He sounded frantic. "You have to get out of there," he said. I don't know how to explain it, but something's happening in those woods. Something's wrong with the treehouse. I asked him what he meant, but all he could tell me was that he had seen something there, something that shouldn't be. He didn't go into detail, but the urgency in his voice was enough to send a chill down my spine. So I did what any person would do. I ignored the warning. A few days later, I found myself back at the treehouse again. This time, I wasn't alone. A few friends had come along, and we were laughing, joking like we used to do when we were kids. But as the sun began to set, that same eerie feeling crept over me. The wind picked up, and the woods seemed to grow darker with each passing minute. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in a clearing just outside the treehouse. But this time, it wasn't just one. There were several of them, tall, thin, featureless figures, like the one I had seen as a child. They were standing in a circle surrounding the treehouse. Their heads were tilted at unnatural angles, and their limbs seemed to stretch toward us, as if beckoning us to come closer. The air grew thick, heavy with dread. My friends hadn't seen them yet, but I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that if we didn't leave soon, we wouldn't be leaving at all. I grabbed my friends by the arms, pulling them toward the ladder. "We need to go. Now!" But when we turned to leave, the figures were gone. There was no trace of them. No sound. No movement. Just the stillness of the woods. We didn't wait around to find out where they had gone. We ran, and we didn't stop until we were safely back at the house. We never spoke of that night again. But the treehouse stayed there. Silent. Watching. I don't go back to that treehouse anymore. And if you ask me to go, I'll tell you the same thing I tell everyone else. Some things are better left undisturbed. Some places aren't meant to be explored. And the treehouse in the woods? It's one of them. As the years went by, the treehouse became more of a ghost in my memory than a tangible place. I moved away for college, and life began to take over. Classes, new friends, and the daily grind. Yet, no matter how far I tried to distance myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that the treehouse wasn't done with me. It wasn't just a place from my past. It felt like it had a life of its own, like it was waiting for me. Years later, after graduating and beginning my writing career, I returned to my hometown. My parents were selling the old house, and they needed help clearing out decades of belongings. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but the woods surrounding it still had that same haunting, endless quality. And the treehouse? It was still there, sagging under the weight of time, but stubbornly standing. Something about it called to me. It was early evening when I found myself standing beneath the old tree. The air was cool, and the sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward me. The ladder was still intact, though weathered and creaking with every step. Against my better judgment, I climbed. The moment I stepped into the treehouse, the air changed. It felt heavier, like stepping into a room where a conversation had just ended, leaving behind an invisible tension. The inside was nearly as I remembered it. Old wooden planks, a few faded carvings my brother and I had etched into the walls. But something was different. The air was colder up there, colder than it should have been. And then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the far corner of the treehouse, where I'd seen the figure all those years ago, was a pile of dirt. Fresh dirt, as if someone had been digging. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Maybe an animal had dragged something up here, or perhaps the wind had blown it in. But as I stepped closer, I saw it wasn't just dirt. It was a small, crudely dug grave. My breath hitched. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. My eyes were glued to the grave, and then, just as I was about to step back, I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, like the distant hum of a breeze, but it grew louder, more distinct. It was a child's voice, soft and pleading. "Help me!" The words sent a jolt through my body. I whipped around, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the treehouse was empty. My mind raced. Was it my imagination? Had the years of writing horror stories finally taken a toll on my sanity? "Help me!" The voice repeated, this time clearer, closer. I backed away from the corner, my hands trembling. And then the floor beneath me creaked. Not the kind of creak that comes from old wood. It was deliberate, rhythmic, like footsteps. I turned, my heart pounding in my chest. And there it was, the girl. She was standing in the doorway of the treehouse, her tangled hair hanging over her face, her dress dirty and torn. But this time, her vacant eyes were locked on mine. She wasn't glowing like before. She looked more human. But there was something deeply wrong with her presence, something unnatural. I tried to speak, to ask her what she wanted, but my voice wouldn't come. She tilted her head, her gaze unblinking, and then she pointed toward the grave. I shook my head, stepping back. "No," I whispered. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, her fingers still pointing. And then, as suddenly as she appeared, she began to fade. Her body dissolved into the shadows, leaving behind only the sound of her voice. "Help me!" I scrambled down the ladder, my heart racing. I didn't stop running until I was back inside the house. My parents noticed my pale face and shaking hands, but I didn't tell them what I'd seen. I couldn't. How could I explain something that didn't make sense even to me? That night, I barely slept. The girl's voice haunted me, replaying over and over in my mind. What was she trying to tell me? What was buried in that treehouse? The next morning, I made a decision. I had to know. Armed with a flashlight and a small shovel, I returned to the treehouse just as the sun began to rise. The woods were eerily quiet, the usual morning birdsong replaced by an oppressive silence. As I climbed the ladder, every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn back. But I didn't. When I reached the treehouse, the grave was still there, undisturbed. My hands trembled as I began to dig. The dirt was loose, almost too loose, as if it had been placed there intentionally. With every scoop, my dread grew. And then the shovel hit something solid. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. Slowly, carefully, I brushed the dirt away, revealing a small wooden box. It was old, the wood darkened with age and moisture. My hands shook as I lifted it out of the ground. I opened it. Inside was a single, weathered doll, its porcelain face cracked and stained. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and its mouth was painted in a faint, unsettling smile. Beneath the doll was a piece of paper, folded and yellowed with time. I unfolded it, my heart pounding. Scrawled in shaky handwriting were the words, "Do not disturb her." At that moment, the air around me grew icy. and a shadow fell over the treehouse. I looked up, and there she was, the girl, standing in the corner, her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before: anger. Before I could react, the treehouse shook violently, as if the tree itself were trying to tear it apart. I dropped the box and scrambled for the ladder, barely making it down before the entire structure groaned under the pressure. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran, the sound of the girl's voice echoing in my ears. Do not disturb her. To this day, I don't know who she was or why she haunted that treehouse. But one thing is certain: some places hold secrets that should never be uncovered. And that treehouse, it's a secret I'll carry with me forever. Growing up in a small town nestled deep in the woods of New England, I was surrounded by tales of the supernatural. Every creak in the floorboards, every gust of wind through the trees, seemed to carry whispers of something unseen. I was drawn to these stories, both as a child and later as an adult. But it wasn't until one summer, when I was about 11, that I experienced a story of my own, one that still haunts me to this day. Behind our old house stood a sprawling forest. My brother and I spent countless afternoons there, climbing trees, building forts, and imagining adventures. One day we decided to build a tree house, a real one, high in the branches of the largest oak we could find. With the help of some leftover wood and nails, we created what felt like our own private castle. It wasn't perfect. It creaked when the wind blew, and the planks didn't quite line up, but it was ours. For the first few weeks, it was everything we dreamed of. We spent hours up there reading comic books and daring each other to look out at the haunted parts of the woods. But then something changed. It started with a strange feeling. Every time I climbed up to the treehouse, I felt like I was being watched. At first, I brushed it off, just my imagination running wild. But soon, it became impossible to ignore. One late afternoon, while sitting alone in the treehouse, I heard it. A faint sound like someone whispering my name. I froze, my heart pounding. Jason, the voice called, barely audible, carried on the breeze. It wasn't my brother. He was inside the house. And it wasn't coming from the ground below. It was coming from the forest. I peered out through the small window, but I couldn't see anything. The woods were still, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. That night, I told my brother about the voice. He laughed it off, calling me a scaredy cat. But I could see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. Something about the treehouse or the forest around it had always felt off. The next day, my brother insisted we go back to the treehouse together. He wanted to prove there was nothing to be afraid of. Reluctantly, I followed him up the ladder. The moment we climbed inside, the air felt heavier, colder, despite the summer heat. See, he said, sitting on the floor. There's nothing here. But then, as if to mock him, the whisper came again. This time, we both heard it. Jason, Michael. We froze, staring at each other, our faces pale. The voice was louder now, and it seemed to come from all around us. My brother crawled to the window and looked out, his face twisted in confusion. There's no one out there, he said, his voice trembling. Before we could decide what to do, the treehouse began to creak. Not the usual groan of wood shifting, but a rhythmic creaking, like footsteps moving across the planks. But we were the only ones inside. Then, the trapdoor leading to the ladder slammed shut. We both screamed, scrambling to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like someone or something was holding it closed from below. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and now it wasn't just calling our names. It was saying something else, something we couldn't understand. A language that felt old, wrong, and full of malice. Suddenly, the entire treehouse shook violently. My brother grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the window. "We have to jump," he shouted. I hesitated, looking down at the long drop to the ground. But before I could argue, the floor beneath us started to crack. The wood splintered, and I swear I saw dark, thin fingers reaching up through the gaps. We jumped. The fall knocked the wind out of me, but adrenaline pushed me to my feet. My brother was already up, dragging me toward the house. As we ran, I glanced back at the treehouse. For a split second, I saw a figure standing inside, a tall, shadowy silhouette with glowing eyes. And then it was gone. We told our parents what happened, but they didn't believe us. They said the treehouse was just old and unsafe, that it must have been a trick of the light. But my brother and I knew the truth. Over the years, we avoided the treehouse, letting it fall into disrepair. But sometimes, late at night, I'd hear it. The creaking of wood, the faint sound of whispering, and I'd wonder if it was waiting for us to come back. Years later, when I was an adult, I returned to that house. The treehouse was still there, barely standing, overgrown with moss and vines. Against my better judgment, I climbed the ladder one last time. Inside, I found something I hadn't noticed before, a small, carved symbol etched into one of the wooden planks. It was crude, but unmistakable, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, like a sun, or a spider. I took a picture of the symbol and showed it to a friend of mine who studied folklore. Her face went pale when she saw it. "This is an old protection symbol," she said. "It's meant to keep something trapped." I didn't sleep that night. The treehouse was destroyed shortly after the property was sold. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers. And I wonder, did we destroy the treehouse? Or did we set something free? Destroying the treehouse should have been the end of it. That's what I told myself. It was just a treehouse, after all, a few pieces of rotting wood nailed together in a forest that no longer belonged to me. And yet, after it was gone, the unease only grew stronger. It started subtly. Weeks after the demolition, I'd wake up in the dead of night, convinced I heard creaking wood outside my window. On more than one occasion, I thought I saw movement in the shadows, something tall, thin, and impossibly dark. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. At first, I chalked it up to lingering nerves, a leftover fear from my childhood. But then the dreams began. In these dreams, I was back in the treehouse. It wasn't old and crumbling like I remembered, but pristine, as if it had been freshly built. The air inside was heavy, oppressive, and the whispering voices surrounded me. They didn't just call my name anymore. They spoke in that same strange, guttural language I couldn't understand. The worst part was the feeling, a gnawing dread that whatever was in the treehouse with me wasn't just watching. It was waiting. One night, the dream took a darker turn. I was sitting in the corner of the treehouse, paralyzed, as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was the girl, the one I'd seen all those years ago. Her face was pale, her hair wild and tangled, and her eyes, they weren't human. They were black, endless voids that seemed to pull the air from the room. "You shouldn't have destroyed it," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you want?" Her lips curled into a twisted smile. "You let it out." Before I could ask her what she meant, she lunged at me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. The room was silent, but the feeling from the dream lingered, heavy and suffocating. The next morning, I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I pulled up the photo of the carved symbol I'd taken years ago and contacted my friend, the one who'd recognized it as a protection symbol. When she answered, I wasted no time. "I need to know more about that symbol," I said. "What exactly was it protecting?" There was a pause on the other end. "Jason," she said carefully, "I didn't want to scare you before, but that symbol is ancient. It's not just for protection, it's a binding sigil. It's used to trap something dangerous, something that isn't meant to exist in our world." I felt a cold chill crawl up my spine. "And what happens if it's destroyed?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Then whatever was holding back is free." That conversation set off a chain reaction of events I still struggle to explain. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences escalated. Objects in my home would move on their own, small things at first like books or keys. But then, one night, I woke to find my bedroom door wide open, though I'd locked it before bed. The final straw came a week later. I was working late in my office when I heard it, the sound of creaking wood like footsteps on a floorboard. The sound was faint at first, coming from somewhere in the house. I froze, listening. The creaking grew louder, closer, until it stopped just outside my office door. For a long moment, there was silence. Then a single knock. I didn't move. My breath caught in my throat as the door slowly creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness. And then I saw it, just for a moment, standing in the shadows. The figure. It was taller now, its limbs impossibly long and thin. Its face was a blank canvas of pale, featureless skin, and those eyes, black and endless, stared straight through me. "You shouldn't have destroyed it," the voice said, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. I stumbled backward, knocking over my chair. When I looked again, the figure was gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. Desperate for answers, I returned to my hometown the next day. I needed to know what my brother remembered, what he might have experienced since the treehouse had been destroyed. But when I arrived, I found his house empty. His neighbors told me he'd left suddenly a few days earlier, leaving no forwarding address. It was as if he'd vanished. In a final act of desperation, I returned to the forest where the treehouse once stood. The clearing was overgrown now, the ground uneven where the treehouse had been torn down. I stood there for hours, searching for something, a sign, an answer. As the sun set, the woods grew darker, and the familiar feeling of being watched returned. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it. The whispering. It was louder now, more insistent, and it was coming from the ground beneath my feet. I knelt down, brushing away the leaves and dirt, and found something I hadn't expected. The symbol. It was carved into the earth, deeper and more intricate than the one in the treehouse. But it was broken, the lines disrupted, as if someone or something had clawed through it. And as I stared at it, the realization hit me like a cold wave. The treehouse hadn't been the prison. The forest was, and by destroying the treehouse, I'd broken the last barrier, keeping whatever it was contained. I wish I could say I found a way to fix it, to put things back the way they were. But I haven't. The whispers follow me now, no matter where I go. The figure appears in my dreams, in the corners of my vision, always watching, always waiting. And I know, deep down, that it's only a matter of time before it comes for me. So, if you ever find yourself wandering through the woods and you stumble upon a place that feels wrong, a place where the air grows heavy and the shadows seem too alive, turn back. Don't explore. Don't disturb it. Some things are meant to stay buried.